independent journalist and the author of Palestine Laboratory. He was based in occupied East Jerusalem between 2016 and 2020. Look, Antony, the two sides are talking, but it certainly does feel like we're at a bit of an impasse right now. Do you agree with that assessment? And realistically, what can change so that we can move forward, or things can be moved forward?
You know, when we've been talking about a ceasefire in the last while, of course, it's true that there has been a general cessation of violence between Israel and Hamas, but it's worth saying that a lot of Palestinians in Gaza are still being killed by Israel on a regular basis. I'm not talking about from disease and starvation. I'm talking about from actual weapons, from Israeli guns. But look, ultimately, it seems at the moment that the Trump administration wants to move this to the next level, namely trying to get out more and more of the hostages, including, of course, there's an American who's alive and others. There's massive pressure within Israel itself, within the public, to continue the ceasefire. Yes, there's an Israeli far right that's desperate for the war to continue, and I fear that that far right movement is only growing in strength. And I think it's worth saying that although the Arab League, as your introduction said, has proposed an idea for a so-called reconstruction backed by the EU as an alternative to what the Trump administration has proposed, it is a deeply, deeply problematic plan. I note in the last few days that Forensic Architecture, which is a British-based organisation, has put out a real detailed report explaining why this is so, that so much of what the Arab League is proposing in Gaza, yes, it's better than forcibly removing Palestinians, of course that's a given, but what they're essentially doing is accepting so much of what Israel has done in the last 18 or so months, allowing a lot of the so-called buffer zones that Israel has created, building huge amounts of homes easily accessible by Israel to go back in and out whenever they want. In other words, Israel uses architecture as a weapon. And if we allow the rebuilding of Gaza to be akin to how it was in the past, and I fear that this Arab League proposal is similar to that, this will not avoid problems down the track.
Okay, so I mean, what you're saying there is that this plan from Arab nations is far from perfect, even though it has been agreed upon by Arab leaders. It's still been rejected by the US. It's still been rejected by Israel. I suppose, like, what needs to change then if we're going to move forward? Because we're currently at this stage where both sides are saying, we don't want what you're suggesting, we don't want what you're suggesting. So where do we go from here? Because, as you said in your first sentence, this risks devolving once again into a much broader, much more intense wave of violence again.
Look, obviously what I'm suggesting is not a rejectionist position like Israel or the US. My reasons, of course, are very different because I've looked at the plan and it worries me that, in fact, what is going to happen if that plan goes into place, which I might say, it's worth mentioning, Israel fundamentally opposes any of it. And as we've seen time and time and time again, what I fear is, when you say what's likely to happen here, what I fear is you have indefinite tent cities. That's basically what has been the case in Gaza for obviously months, including during the war, that there's no real serious rebuilding because there's no real interest from the Israeli perspective to do so, nor I would argue the US. And I think ultimately the question really is so much what happens to Gaza is, at the moment, no Palestinians are going in and out. There's a handful that have been, thankfully, able to leave for medical care, particularly in the UAE and elsewhere. But most Palestinians are trapped in Gaza. Rafah is closed, the main border crossing between Egypt and Israel and Gaza. And I think one ultimate point that does need to be mentioned, you say what should come next, is we should not be accepting, in my view, and I say we, the international community, the EU, Arab League people, a plan that is deeply flawed. Because it's not a forcible removal of people from Gaza does not therefore mean that the alternative is much better. And I worry that because the Arab countries are so desperate for there not to be ethnic cleansing or a continuation of ethnic cleansing, they're willing to put on the table a plan that they hope will get Israeli buy-in. And it hasn't and it won't. So the ultimate stage, briefly, needs to be here. Obviously, all hostages need to be removed and as in need to be released, of course. But the bottom line remains the same here, that there is a deep feeling within much of the Israeli government, and I would argue in the Israeli public, not just to settle Gaza, but to forcibly remove people from Gaza. And until that is accepted and reckoned with, which I would argue the international community is not doing, we will remain in a very ugly and dangerous limbo.
And Antony, just briefly for us, I wonder, you mentioned Donald Trump in your first answer, and we've heard his comments in the last few hours saying possibly he's, rowing back on what he initially said about Palestinians being expelled. Of course, the ceasefire happened just as he was coming into office. Do you think he's been a force for good overall in moving this forward, in getting the ceasefire and opening up these conversations? Or do you worry that his impact on the conflict in the longer term might not be so positive?
I mean, look, Trump's focus is basically, about as much as a goldfish. So I agree that he said in the last 12 hours that he doesn't support the removal of Palestinians, whereas he also said, by the way, in the same press conference, that Chuck Schumer, who is a very pro-Israel Democrat, somehow is a Palestinian. That's somehow deemed the worst offence in the world. I mean, look, one can't really trust what Trump says. I mean, that's been clear on a range of issues from Palestine to trade. And has Trump been a force for good? Well, the war, I guess, did stop when he came to office, which, of course, we all welcomed. But his ultimate vision and what he's been talking about for the last 2 months is an Israeli far-right vision. Groups in Israel have always wanted to remove Palestinians from Gaza, always, either in one go or step by step. So do I think Trump is a force for good? No, I think Trump is actually in some ways a continuation of Biden, because Biden allowed us to get to this moment. Change was not going to happen in Gaza or in Palestine during the Trump administration. I'm talking about for the better. It just won't happen. Trump is surrounding himself with far-right fanatics in general. And I think ultimately there needs to be much more pressure from the international community, from other global forces, from the global south, etc., to not accept the fact that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza should live indefinite occupation, because that is essentially where we're at. Trump is offering nothing which is against that. Nothing which is against that. So do I trust Trump? Only a fool would trust Trump.
Only a fool would trust Trump. All right, Antony Loewenstein from Australia, thank you so much for your analysis.